The avoidance of cheating stems from profound psychological dysfunction, rooted in their terror of emotional dependency, their unconscious need to sabotage relationships that feel too meaningful, and their pathological requirement to maintain multiple escape routes from any connection that threatens their defensive programming. Their cheating operates as a sophisticated emotional insurance policy designed to prevent the vulnerability that genuine monogamy would require, the terrifying commitment to one person who could potentially devastate them through abandonment or betrayal. Understanding avoidant infidelity means recognizing that their betrayal serves multiple psychological functions simultaneously. It maintains their sense of power and control over relationship outcomes. It prevents them from becoming too emotionally invested in any single person. And it provides them with evidence that they remain desirable and autonomous rather than dependent on their primary partner for emotional regulation and identity validation. The psychology behind their cheating includes their fundamental belief that relationships are temporary and people inevitably leave, making emotional investment in monogamy feel like psychological suicide for someone whose attachment wounds have taught them that complete commitment equals complete vulnerability to devastating abandonment. Cheating allows them to maintain the illusion of connection while protecting themselves from the total emotional investment that faithful commitment would require. Avoidant infidelity also serves their unconscious agenda to prove that love doesn't work, that commitment is impossible, and that their defensive strategies protect them from the inevitable disappointment that genuine emotional investment creates. When they cheat, they create the very relationship failure they fear while maintaining the comfortable narrative that betrayal was inevitable rather than their conscious choice to destroy what they couldn't emotionally tolerate. The psychological foundation includes their profound discomfort with being truly known by one person, their terror of emotional transparency that monogamous relationships eventually require, and their desperate need to maintain mystery and emotional distance that multiple relationships provide through compartmentalization of different aspects of their personality across various partners who never receive complete access to their authentic self. Their cheating psychology operates through emotional numbing that allows them to betray without experiencing appropriate guilt, empathy, or remorse for their partner's pain and the relationship damage their betrayal creates. They've learned to disconnect from emotional consequences through sophisticated defensive mechanisms that prioritize their psychological comfort over ethical behavior and authentic human connection. Most significantly, avoidant infidelity serves their pathological need to remain the pursued party rather than the pursuer, the desired rather than the one who desires, the one with options rather than the one who depends on their partner's continued presence and emotional investment. Multiple relationships maintain their sense of desirability and power while preventing them from experiencing the vulnerability of genuine need and authentic emotional dependency. The psychology includes their unconscious belief that they deserve punishment for their emotional limitations, their attachment wounds, and their inability to provide the sustained emotional presence that healthy relationships require. Cheating creates the relationship chaos and eventual abandonment that confirms their negative self-worth while allowing them to maintain the narrative that they were rejected for their authentic self rather than their behavioral choices. Understanding this psychology reveals that avoidant infidelity represents sophisticated self-sabotage disguised as sexual adventure, emotional cowardice disguised as relationship sophistication, and systematic relationship destruction disguised as maintaining personal freedom and autonomy that actually serves their psychological dysfunction rather than authentic desires for connection and meaningful partnership. The psychological drivers ultimately demonstrate that avoidant cheating serves their fears rather than their authentic needs, their defensive programming rather than genuine desires, and their unconscious agenda to destroy relationships before relationships can require the sustained vulnerability and emotional investment that their attachment wounds make feel impossible to provide without devastating psychological consequences they cannot risk experiencing. Why? Emotional insurance and backup plans. The avoidant treats their primary relationship like a high-risk investment that requires diversification to prevent total loss, creating elaborate backup relationship systems designed to ensure they never experience the complete emotional devastation they associate with putting all their attachment eggs in one psychological basket. This insurance mentality transforms infidelity from moral failing into strategic necessity for someone whose attachment wounds have taught them that emotional dependency on one person guarantees eventual psychological destruction. Their backup plans operate through careful cultivation of multiple emotional and physical connections that provide different types of validation, support, and ego satisfaction without requiring the total vulnerability that monogamous commitment would demand. They maintain relationships with ex-partners who provide familiarity and ego validation, develop connections with new people who offer excitement and novelty, and preserve flirtations that confirm their continued desirability without demanding emotional investment. Understanding their insurance strategy means recognizing that avoidants cannot tolerate the psychological exposure that comes with complete relationship investment. The terrifying possibility that their partner could leave and eliminate their primary source of emotional regulation, identity, validation, and psychological stability. Multiple relationships provide the illusion of security through emotional diversification that prevents any single person from holding complete power over their well-being. The backup system includes their strategic maintenance of emotional distance within their primary relationship to ensure they never become so attached that betrayal would create unbearable psychological pain. They calibrate their emotional investment to remain below the threshold where loss would feel devastating, using infidelity as a method for regulating their attachment level and preventing dangerous emotional dependency. Their emotional insurance extends to their need for validation from multiple sources, because their wounded self-worth cannot be sustained through one person's love and attention alone. They require constant confirmation of their desirability, intelligence, and worth from various people who provide different types of ego satisfaction that their primary partner cannot supply consistently enough to meet their psychological needs. The backup mentality also serves their unconscious belief that their primary relationship will eventually fail, that their partner will eventually leave or disappoint them, and that emotional preparation for inevitable abandonment requires maintaining alternative connections that can provide emotional support during their anticipated relationship crisis and eventual return to defensive isolation. Most insidiously, their insurance strategy includes their systematic emotional withholding from their primary partner to prevent becoming too invested while simultaneously seeking emotional fulfillment through backup relationships that feel safer because they lack the commitment and vulnerability that makes their primary relationship feel psychologically threatening and emotionally dangerous. The avoidance backup plans often include past lovers who remain emotionally available for validation and ego satisfaction, work colleagues who provide intellectual stimulation and flirtation, and new acquaintances who offer the excitement of potential relationships without the established emotional investment that makes their primary relationship feel suffocating and psychologically overwhelming. Understanding this insurance mentality reveals why avoidants often maintain inappropriate boundaries with others while expecting complete loyalty from their primary partner. They need the security of knowing they have options while their partner remains completely invested in someone who cannot reciprocate total emotional investment without triggering their defensive programming and attachment fears. The emotional insurance system ultimately serves their psychological need to feel powerful and in control of relationship outcomes, rather than vulnerable to someone else's choices about continuing or ending their connection. Multiple relationships provide the illusion that they cannot be devastated by any single person's decision to leave, though this protection comes at the cost of authentic intimacy and genuine satisfaction. Their backup strategy also includes their unconscious preparation for relationship failure through infidelity that creates the very betrayal and abandonment they fear, allowing them to maintain control over the timing and circumstances of relationship destruction rather than risking the vulnerable position of being left by someone who discovered their emotional limitations and chose to seek genuine reciprocity elsewhere. When the trigger points for avoidant cheating occur, avoidant infidelity typically erupts during specific relationship phases that trigger their deepest attachment fears, with the highest risk periods occurring when their primary relationship begins feeling too secure, too emotionally intimate, or too much like the genuine commitment that their defensive programming interprets as psychological imprisonment requiring immediate escape through betrayal that restores their sense of freedom and emotional control. The primary trigger point occurs during relationship stability, when their partner's consistent love and emotional availability begins penetrating their defensive walls, creating the terrifying possibility that they might actually depend on this person for psychological regulation and emotional satisfaction. This stability triggers panic about vulnerability and potential loss that drives them toward infidelity as a method for creating emotional distance and relationship chaos. Understanding these triggers means recognizing that avoidants often cheat when relationships are going well rather than during obvious difficulties, when their partner is showing increased love and commitment rather than emotional distance, and when the relationship offers genuine potential for long-term satisfaction rather than temporary convenience that matches their emotional limitations and defensive preferences. The intimacy trigger manifests when their partner achieves emotional breakthrough that feels too penetrating, too knowing, or too emotionally exposing for their defensive comfort. Moments of genuine vulnerability, authentic emotional sharing, or deep mutual understanding often precipitate cheating episodes as their nervous system interprets emotional transparency as dangerous exposure, requiring immediate protective action through betrayal. Commitment escalation serves as a powerful infidelity trigger when their partner begins discussing future plans, deeper commitment, or relationship progression that would require sustained emotional investment and vulnerability beyond their current comfort level. Talk of marriage, moving in together, or exclusive commitment often triggers cheating as their attachment system activates defensive responses to prevent emotional entrapment. Holiday and anniversary periods frequently trigger avoidant infidelity because these occasions force acknowledgement of relationship significance and emotional investment that feels overwhelming to someone whose defensive programming prefers casual connection over meaningful partnership. The forced intimacy and emotional expression expected during these times often drives them toward affairs that restore their sense of emotional distance. Personal success or achievement triggers can precipitate cheating when their accomplishments create emotional highs that make them feel powerful and desirable to others, when increased confidence makes them question whether they're settling for their current partner, or when external validation makes their primary relationship feel limiting rather than enhancing to their ego and sense of personal worth. Their partner's emotional needs or requests for greater intimacy often serve as infidelity triggers because such needs highlight their emotional limitations while creating pressure for emotional investment that feels overwhelming. Rather than addressing their incapacity for sustained intimacy, they seek validation from new partners who don't yet know their emotional limitations or make such demands. Conflict or relationship challenges trigger cheating when their defensive system interprets problems as evidence that the relationship is doomed, making infidelity feel like reasonable preparation for inevitable relationship failure. Instead of working through difficulties, they begin cultivating backup relationships that can replace their primary connection when it eventually collapses. Life transitions like career changes, family stress, or personal growth periods often trigger avoidant infidelity because change creates emotional instability that their defensive system manages through familiar patterns of relationship chaos and emotional diversification rather than seeking support and stability through their primary relationship. Understanding these trigger patterns reveals that avoidant cheating often represents their unconscious sabotage of relationships that offer genuine potential for healing and growth, their systematic destruction of connections that could provide the emotional satisfaction they crave, but find too psychologically threatening to sustain through authentic vulnerability and sustained emotional investment. Most significantly, recognizing these triggers helps explain why avoidant infidelity often shocks their partners who believe the relationship was progressing positively, why betrayal occurs during relationship highs rather than lows, and why their cheating represents defensive response to love rather than reaction to relationship problems or dissatisfaction with their primary partner. When the timing patterns of betrayal occur, the avoidance infidelity follows predictable temporal patterns that reveal their psychological rhythms around attachment and detachment, with their betrayals occurring during specific windows, when their defensive programming creates optimal conditions for seeking external validation, while their primary relationship feels either too demanding or too emotionally satisfying for their psychological comfort levels. The honeymoon betrayal pattern emerges during the early relationship phase, when their partner's increasing attachment and emotional investment begins triggering their fear of being truly known and potentially rejected for their authentic self. As their partner falls deeper in love, the avoidant often seeks external validation to confirm their desirability while testing whether they can maintain emotional options that prevent complete dependency on one person's affection. Understanding timing patterns means recognizing that avoidants often cheat during relationship milestones that should represent celebration and commitment deepening after moving in together during engagement periods, or following declarations of love that create pressure for reciprocal emotional investment beyond their current capacity or comfort level with sustained vulnerability and mutual dependency. The seasonal pattern frequently emerges around major holidays, anniversaries, and relationship celebrations that force acknowledgement of their emotional investment and partnership significance. Christmas, Valentine's Day, and their relationship anniversary often trigger infidelity as their nervous system rebels against the forced intimacy and emotional expression. These occasions demand from someone whose defensive programming interprets such requirements as psychological suffocation. Travel and separation periods create high-risk windows for avoidant infidelity because physical distance from their partner eliminates immediate accountability while providing opportunities for consequence-free exploration of their attractiveness and desirability to others. Business trips, family visits, and solo vacations often become hunting grounds for validation that confirms their continued options and autonomous identity. The success-based timing pattern occurs when professional achievements, personal accomplishments, or increased social status create inflated ego states that make their current relationship feel limiting or beneath their elevated sense of self-worth. Promotions, awards, or recognition often precede infidelity episodes as their increased confidence makes them question whether they're settling for their current partner. Stress and crisis periods trigger betrayal when life challenges create emotional pressure that their defensive system manages through familiar patterns of chaos creation and emotional diversification rather than seeking support from their primary relationship. Family emergencies, health scares, or financial stress often precipitate affairs as they seek comfort in less emotionally demanding connections. The pre-commitment timing reveals itself when relationship discussions turn toward future planning, exclusive commitment, or deeper emotional investment that would require sustained vulnerability beyond their current comfort level. Marriage proposals, relationship ultimatums, or partner pressure for greater commitment often trigger immediate infidelity as their attachment system activates emergency defensive responses. Post-conflict timing patterns emerge after arguments or relationship difficulties, when their pride prevents them from reconciling appropriately, while their ego seeks validation that they remain desirable despite relationship problems. Rather than working through issues with their partner, they pursue external validation that confirms their attractiveness and worth, avoiding the vulnerability that genuine conflict resolution requires. The boredom-based pattern occurs during relationship routine phases, when their partner's consistent love and emotional availability begins feeling familiar rather than exciting, predictable rather than stimulating, and secure rather than challenging to their psychological system that requires novelty and uncertainty to maintain engagement and interest. Understanding these timing patterns reveals that avoidant infidelity represents their systematic sabotage of relationship progression, their unconscious prevention of emotional deepening, and their strategic creation of emotional distance during periods when genuine intimacy becomes possible, or when their defensive programming interprets relationship success as psychological threat requiring immediate protective action. The cyclical nature of their betrayal timing often follows their internal emotional rhythms around attachment and detachment, where periods of increased closeness with their partner create psychological pressure that gets released through infidelity that restores their sense of emotional distance and psychological autonomy while confirming their beliefs about relationships' temporary nature. Most significantly, recognizing their timing patterns helps explain why avoidant infidelity often appears random or inexplicable to their partners, but actually follows their internal psychological calendar around attachment fears, commitment phobias, and defensive responses to emotional intimacy that their nervous system interprets as existential threat requiring immediate escape through betrayal. How the compartmentalization strategy works. The avoidant executes infidelity through sophisticated psychological compartmentalization that allows them to maintain completely separate emotional realities for different relationships, creating mental and emotional walls between their various connections that prevent guilt, cognitive dissonance, or emotional conflict from interfering with their ability to function normally within each distinct relationship dynamic. This compartmentalization operates like a psychological filing system where their primary relationship exists in one mental folder. Their affair relationships occupy separate folders, and these different aspects of their life never merge or communicate with each other within their internal psychological landscape. They become different versions of themselves with different partners, presenting authentic aspects of their personality to each person while never allowing complete integration. Understanding their compartmentalization means recognizing that avoidants can genuinely care about their primary partner while simultaneously pursuing affairs, because these relationships exist in completely separate psychological territories that don't influence each other within their defensive mental architecture. They're not lying when they express love for their primary partner. They're simply accessing different emotional compartments. The strategy includes creating physical and temporal boundaries that maintain separation between their various relationships, using different communication devices for different partners, maintaining separate social circles that never intersect, and carefully managing schedules to prevent their multiple relationships from creating logistical conflicts that would force integration of their compartmentalized emotional life. Their compartmentalization extends to emotional regulation, where they can feel genuine affection and sexual attraction within each separate relationship without experiencing cognitive dissonance about their behavior or guilt about their betrayal. Each relationship serves different psychological functions that don't compete with each other because they exist in isolated mental territories. The avoidant's ability to compartmentalize includes sophisticated emotional switching mechanisms that allow them to transition between different relationship personas without internal conflict or visible emotional inconsistency. They become the devoted partner during time with their primary relationship, while transforming into the exciting new lover during affair encounters without psychological strain. Their compartmentalization strategy also includes selective memory activation, where they can focus completely on their current relationship context while temporarily suppressing awareness of their other connections. When with their primary partner, their affairs feel psychologically distant and irrelevant. When with affair partners, their primary relationship becomes emotionally invisible. This psychological separation allows them to maintain different communication styles, emotional intimacy levels, and relationship expectations with different partners without feeling internally conflicted about the contradictions in their behavior. They adapt their authentic self to match what each relationship can handle while maintaining emotional distance that prevents total vulnerability in any single connection. The compartmentalization includes their ability to justify their behavior within each relationship context without considering the broader ethical implications or emotional impact on all parties involved. They can rationalize their affairs as meeting needs their primary relationship can't fulfill, while simultaneously rationalizing their primary relationship as their genuine emotional commitment that affairs don't threaten. Understanding this strategy reveals why avoidants can pass lie detector tests about their affairs. They genuinely believe their own compartmentalized emotional reality, where their affair relationships don't threaten or contradict their primary relationship because these connections exist in separate psychological dimensions that don't influence each other. The compartmentalization also explains why avoidants often seem genuinely confused when confronted about their infidelity. They've maintained such complete psychological separation between their various relationships that integrating these different aspects of their life creates genuine cognitive dissonance and emotional confusion about their own motivations and feelings. Most significantly, their compartmentalization strategy allows them to avoid the guilt, empathy, and emotional consequences that would normally prevent infidelity in psychologically integrated individuals. By maintaining emotional separation between their various relationships, they eliminate the internal conflict that would force them to choose between betrayal and loyalty, between multiple relationships and authentic commitment. This psychological separation ultimately serves their defensive need to avoid the vulnerability and emotional integration that genuine monogamy would require. The terrifying prospect of placing all their emotional investment in one person who could potentially devastate them through abandonment, rejection, or discovery of their authentic self, including their profound attachment wounds and emotional limitations. How the justification and rationalization machine works. The avoidant constructs elaborate psychological justification systems that transform their infidelity from moral betrayal into reasonable behavior, creating sophisticated rationalization frameworks that allow them to maintain positive self-image while systematically violating their partner's trust and the fundamental agreements that healthy relationships require for emotional safety and genuine intimacy. Their primary justification revolves around redefining infidelity itself, where emotional affairs become just friendships, physical encounters become meaningless mistakes, and ongoing deceptions become protecting their partner from unnecessary pain. They create semantic gymnastics that allow them to minimize the significance of their betrayals while maintaining the narrative that they're actually considerate partners who prioritize their primary relationship. Understanding their rationalization machinery means recognizing how they transform their emotional limitations into relationship justifications, where their inability to provide sustained emotional intimacy becomes evidence that their primary relationship cannot meet all their needs, requiring external supplementation through affairs that actually serve their psychological comfort rather than addressing legitimate relationship deficits. The avoidant often justifies their infidelity by blaming their partner's emotional needs, characterizing normal requests for intimacy and emotional availability as suffocating demands that force them to seek relief through relationships with people who don't require such overwhelming emotional investment. They position their affairs as escape from unreasonable relationship pressure rather than betrayal of someone who deserves basic loyalty and honesty. Their justification system includes sophisticated victim narratives where they become the wronged party in relationships. They systematically betray, claiming their partner's jealousy, suspicion, or emotional needs drove them toward infidelity. They reframe their betrayal as natural consequence of their partner's failure to provide adequate space, understanding, or appreciation for their unique emotional needs and defensive patterns. The rationalization extends to their belief that their affairs actually improve their primary relationship by meeting needs elsewhere that would otherwise create pressure within their main connection. They convince themselves that their infidelity serves their primary relationship by allowing them to remain emotionally available rather than feeling overwhelmed by having all their psychological needs dependent on one person's capacity to provide satisfaction. Their justification machinery includes minimizing the emotional impact of their betrayals, claiming their affairs mean nothing significant while their primary relationship represents their genuine emotional investment. They create hierarchies of significance that allow them to maintain multiple relationships while convincing themselves that only their primary connection truly matters despite their systematic violation of its fundamental boundaries. The avoidant often rationalizes their infidelity through philosophical arguments about human nature, monogamy's impossibility, and relationship evolution that supposedly transcends traditional commitment models. They position their betrayals as sophisticated understanding of love's complexity rather than simple moral failure and emotional cowardice that prioritizes their comfort over their partner's emotional safety and relationship security. Their rationalization system includes rewriting relationship history to justify their current behavior, where their partner's past mistakes, emotional reactions, or relationship shortcomings become retroactive permission for infidelity. They create elaborate causal narratives that make their affairs seem like inevitable responses to relationship problems rather than choices that create those very problems. Understanding this machinery reveals how avoidants maintain cognitive coherence while behaving in fundamentally incoherent ways, using sophisticated psychological defenses to protect their self-image while engaging in behavior that contradicts their stated values and relationship commitments. Their rationalizations serve their psychological comfort rather than ethical consistency or authentic self-awareness. The justification often includes their belief that their superior emotional intelligence and self-awareness excuse their behavior because they understand their actions better than others would, making their infidelity more sophisticated and less harmful than similar betrayals by people who lack their psychological insight and defensive sophistication. Most insidiously, their rationalization machinery prevents them from experiencing appropriate guilt or empathy for their partner's pain, allowing them to continue their betrayals while maintaining the belief that they're fundamentally good people whose circumstances justify behavior that would be inexcusable in others. This psychological protection system ensures they never have to face the true impact of their choices on people who trust and love them. The rationalization ultimately serves their defensive need to avoid accountability for their emotional limitations and behavioral choices, transforming their infidelity from evidence of their character defects into proof of their relationship sophistication, emotional complexity, and superior understanding of love's true nature that transcends conventional morality and commitment structures that feel psychologically threatening to their defensive programming.